Bigger than Chernobyl, the London smog, and even the Minamata epidemic, the drying of the Aral Sea will go down in history as the biggest atrocity against planet Earth. It's nothing short of a crime, and the Soviet Union is to blame. It's true. Soviet's economic growth happened at the expense of the Aral Sea. Non-sustainable farming and repeated testing of weapons has removed the lake from the map. The areas surrounding it are almost inhabitable as the residents fight fatal diseases like cancer. The lake's fragile ecosystem has been destroyed completely, and now the lake screams intergenerational violence at the hand of the totalitarian regime. So why did Russia destroy the fourth largest lake in the world? Before we start, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and hit that bell icon to never miss a video from us. Let's get started. Let's answer the most pressing question first. How come a lake is known to be a sea? Well, that just shows the might of Aral. As far as descriptions of water bodies go, you'll classify it as a lake, but its initial size of 68,000 square kilometers earned it the title of the sea. After all, it was the fourth largest lake in the world, and home to many species of marine and wildlife, as well as the populations in search of drinkable water and food. Until the Soviets' maddening economic ambition got in the way. Located between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, Aral lies in the south. In Kazakhstan, the lake found its local name as the Sea of Islands. Before the lake's biodiversity was altered repeatedly, it hosted more than 1,500 islands. That geographical feature alone made the lake a sight to see, one of the wonders of the world, if you will. Within itself, the lake used to flow with a lot of historicity. Its flush waters that gave life to many are even outlined in the earliest world map of Claudius Ptolemy, a Roman geographer. And a plethora of centuries ahead, you'll find the importance of the lake in the 20th century for nomads in Central Asia. The region around the lake was home to many desert nomads who enjoyed the fresh water and food supply. Later on, the lake also proved monumental in developing the fishing industry in the same region. It also seems like that lake was destined to sustain people in the most bizarre ways. The geographical mapping of the lake isn't suitable for food production at all. You'd be surprised to know that the temperatures of the Aral region at least hit 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That alone would make the evaporation and seepage around the lake so rapid that it wouldn't sustain. On top of everything, the region also receives less than 100 millimeters of rainfall. Basically, the lake should have dried up ages ago. But it only survived because Mother Nature had different plans up on its sleeve. Due to glacial melting in upper regions of Central Asia, two river channels became the saving grace of the Aral Sea. The Amudarya and Sirdarya were the biggest distributors for the lake, as they allowed it to make up for the loss in water. For thousands of years, the jewel of Central Asia was able to maintain its equilibrium, as its tributaries remained untapped. Yet, it's the economic strife of World War I that made the Soviet Union a sovereign of the lake. And the doom of the Aral Sea starts with what the Soviets called the white gold, or commonly known as cotton. Later in history, this good old commodity would prove to be even more important in Stalin's destructive policies of collectivization. A little throwback to the world's economies would tell you that both the US and Great Britain were undefeatable monopolies over export of cotton. Back in the 19th century, those monopolies were hard to break. But when the American stream of cotton seeds were imported to Central Asia, a new era of cotton production was born. Coincidentally, at the same time, the Soviet Union ended its century-old struggle and finally took over Tashkent in 1865. It doesn't take much to understand that cotton production proved to be monumental for Soviet colonialism. With every land it acquired, it gained more and more control of global market share for cotton. What is really interesting is to see how the country upheld its rapid control of the cotton production. You'd imagine that it was the USSR's infamous coercive policies for farmers that maximized the efficiency in cultivation. But the reality was far from it. Instead, the Soviet Union invested in uncultivated territories, and the water came from the biggest feeders of the Aral Lake, the Amudarya and Sirdarya. Decades later, the country kickstarted its policy of collectivization during the ascension of Joseph Stalin. From 1928 to 1940, the totalitarian regime destroyed private farmlands to transform them into collectively and state-controlled farms. Locally, they were called kolkhozes and sovkhozes. A quick glance into history shows us that these policies were highly unpopular for the local farmers who had fought for the emancipation of serfs in 1861. Stalin's policy was against everything Lenin had advocated for. Under the new dictator's rule, there was no promise of peace, land, and bread. Stalin had hoped that bigger collectivized farmlands would ensure food stability in the region, and the booming production of raw materials would save them all. He was still living under the grain procurement crisis of 1928, and how dare the peasants defied their king. But then, how do you meet the irrigation demand of bigger farmlands? Of course, you bleed all the water bodies dry. The very same happened to the Aral Sea when the Soviets actively tried to irrigate the deserts for cultivation. Only that project required tons of water. From maintaining the cotton production to cultivating rice and cereals, it was obvious that the Soviet had a lot to lose. Stalin began to build poorly planned dams and canals on the Aral Sea. Soon enough, almost all of its arteries were drawing off water for Soviet farmlands. At the same time, the lake was also drying up due to acute wastage of water. All the water channels were built poorly. The porous gap in the irrigation system meant that more water was seeping into the ground rather than going to the farmlands. And some of the figures are horrifying. Massive water diversion projects meant that Karakum Canal was wasting almost 30 to 70% of its water to feed the Soviet farmlands. And if the water wastage is matchless in the biggest canal of Central Asia, you can only imagine the damage it did to the Aral Sea. Even after the end of collectivization, the exploitation of the lake didn't stop. The year 1961 proved to be almost fatal for the water body. The Soviet Union wasn't blind to the demise of the Aral Lake. They knew that for every discharge station they install over Amu and Sir is nothing short of a death sentence for their irrigation system. Not only did the drawing power of these rivers drop significantly, Sir also had nothing to feed Aral at all. That should have been enough to scare the Soviet into planning more sustainable ways to manage the sea, but they didn't. Over the course of years, water level in the lake dropped by 31 to 35 inches annually, and by the 1980s, the Soviets had increased its production of white gold exponentially. You'd be shocked to know that rather than increasing efficiency of the existing cotton fields, the country chose to cultivate new lands. It's obvious that the USSR hadn't learned anything from its past mistakes. It began a new era of drawing more and more water for the cotton production in the country, and this is how you kill a lake. In October 1990, Western geologists confirmed that the Aral Lake has disappeared virtually from the face of the Earth. Its original geographical position is highly misplaced. There was some inland indication of Aral running in its eastern part, but NASA's 2014 images show that its eastern lobe doesn't exist anymore. The sea has dried up completely, and now it is called the Aralkum Desert in the local language. Killing the lake is one thing. The Soviet Union also didn't show any mercy to the populations surviving on Aral's freshwater. By 1980, the lake had lost its freshwater supply to contaminated inclusion of sea salts, fertilizers, and harmful minerals. Almost 2 million people relied on the lake to drink water. They tried to kill impurities in water by boiling it, but it wasn't simply enough. High levels of harmful pesticides and herbicides just don't vanish as they are heated. They turn into life-threatening diseases. It was the openness policy of Mikhail Gorbachev that brought media attention to the environmental degradation of the Aral Sea. But by then, it was too late. Several uncensored reports showed high levels of nose, throat, and lung cancer in the region. The infant mortality rate was higher than even in the poorest regions of sub-Saharan Africa. To make matters worse, acute water shortages meant that Soviets were forced to drink water from the irrigation canals made for cotton production. Just that alone is perhaps one of the greatest human rights atrocities in the totalitarian regime. In Western Uzbekistan, children and adults were always fighting jaundice, hepatitis A, and liver maladies. But it's just not the irresponsible irrigation system that has killed people over the years. For the Soviet Union, the Aral Lake was a strategic site to test its biological weapons, especially on the Rebirth Island. That alone left the entire seabed full of toxic chemicals and increased the salinity of the water to unrecoverable levels. Today, you can't find the island on any given map of the Earth, because just like its home, it has also disappeared. High salinity levels also meant that aquatic life won't survive. Once a great sustainable fishery was turned into complete loss of ecosystems by the Soviet. Right in front of our eyes, many species of fishes went extinct. The home to Soviets' prized caviar was also lost eternally. The dried region surrounding the lake also meant extreme levels of sand erosion. But it's just ordinary sand, isn't it? Just like its water, the sand is also contaminated with fertilizers, salts, and pesticides. Frequent dust storms in the area mean that people are still suffering from respiratory infections, throat cancers, acute breathing problems, and so on. It's evident that today's Russia won't ever account for every life lost to their economic policies. Plus, how do you even put a price on a nature's priceless gift? But all hope isn't lost. After the dissolution of the USSR in 1991, the government of present-day Uzbekistan took an initiative to restore the Aral Sea. With the help of neighboring countries like Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and others, Uzbekistan was able to restore some water level in the lake by 2005. Of course, some success only came after a series of failures. As the Soviet ecological damage was almost irreversible, the Aral Sea might not be able to reach its original levels of water and ecological diversity. Even then, neighboring countries and institutions like the UN and World Bank seem hopeful. One huge problem is the high level of erosion that continues to impact the developing seabed around the lake. There's some progress around the northern side of the lake that falls in Kazakhstan. On the flip side, the southern side remains dry and deserted. Most restoration programs aim for afforestation of the region to mitigate the sandstorms. Such programs don't mean that the flush lake and its aquatic life will reappear magically. Not to mention, when citizens are choking on the air, refilling the lake can't be prioritized. Do you invest all of your resources in a project that might not work, or do you help people to breathe properly? The answer is quite clear-cut. What we know for sure that the Soviet Union has millions of crimes to its name, and killing the Aral Sea is one of the unforgivable ones. Enjoyed this video? Give it a big thumbs up, subscribe to our channel for more informative content, and share this video with your friends. See you soon!